It's 1992 and this was a year, for me anyway, that the touch paper was lit on video games going mainstream. Sure, video games had been in the home since 1972, courtesy of the Magnavox Odyssey, but it wasn't to be for about 20 years that things were looking like everyone was going to play. Take for example Games Master and Bad Influence, two shows on two different channels in the UK that showcased new video games and technology. And even Microsoft were up in their game by releasing Windows 3.1, which is still my second favourite Windows operating system. My name's Stuart, this is Generation Pixel, and why don't you take a walk with me down memory lane with the Pixel years. Breaking news in 1992, capitalism goes global as burger chain MacDonald's opened their first restaurant in Red China. Back in the United States, AT&T released their first video telephone, an indication that we truly are heading towards that Star Trek future. The new audio format, the compact disc, has managed to outsell traditional cassettes for the first time. We only now wonder whether the games industry will get into this new fad. And that is your news in 1992. So hello and welcome back to the Pixel years, and it's 1992, an absolutely fantastic year as many of you who experienced it will no doubt attest to. During this episode we will be looking at some of the home games that I played in 1992, some of the arcade games that were out there. We'll listen to a little bit of the music, think about the movies, and just have that general 1992 rad vibe. And to get the show on the road, let's just take a look at the very first game that took up most of my time in 1992, and that was Police Quest in Pursuit of the Death Angel, VGA. Now, a couple of fun facts about Police Quest, and the first one being that this was probably my gateway into point and click adventures. There had been plenty of point and click adventures released before this version of Police Quest, but for some reason I'd managed to avoid all of them until this point. And much like Space Invaders was my gateway into video games as a whole, Rebel Star and the ZX Spectrum was my gateway into turn-based strategy, and Final Fantasy VII was my gateway into JRPGs, then Police Quest Pursuit of the Death Angel was definitely my gateway into point and click adventures. And the second fun fact is this was probably the very first HD remake that I ever played, and probably the first HD remake that I know about. Now don't get me wrong, it's not like the HD remakes we get these days, but Police Quest Pursuit of the Death Angel was originally an EGA game. Now if you're not familiar with PC gaming, or at least early PC gaming, that might not mean anything to you, but it was very much like the jump in fidelity that we see in some of the modern remasters such as Alex Kidd and Miracle World DX and other games of that ilk. Because let me tell you, a jump from EGA to VGA was quite a big deal back then in the early 90s. Now of course it wasn't just the graphics that drew me into Police Quest, it was the gameplay as well. Now there might be a lot of you out there who will associate point and click adventures with something that we like to call moon logic. And for those of you who aren't aware of the term, then moon logic is simply this. It's a puzzle that you have to work out without it having any real logical structure. And if you want to see this sort of logic in action, then you just play something like the Discworld games. Police Quest, however, was completely different from this. Everything in the game was based on actual police procedures. You had to go through your day-to-day life as you would as a regular police officer, and you would have to carry out your duties in a professional and proficient manner. And let me tell you, this sort of gameplay was right up my street in 1992. So without a doubt I would wholeheartedly recommend anyone to play Police Quest, well the VGA version anyway, because it's one of the finest point and click adventures ever made, and especially so if you've never really played a point and click adventure or didn't get into them back in the day, because this one makes sense. And that's Police Quest in Pursuit of the Death Angel from Sierra Online in 1992.
Recently we compared two superheroes, Dashing Super Guy and Kirby from Nintendo. In some ways, Kirby lost big. No big hair, no big muscles, no weapons, nothing. All Kirby's got is appetite. Kirby's Dream Land, the thrilling new adventure game on Game Boy. Kirby munches, spits back, and floats, saving glorious Dreamland. He's Kirby, and he packs a mean bite. Kirby's Dream Land, only on Game Boy.
Next up, and staying with the PC because the PC was where I was at in 1992, we have Caesar. Now I know that city builders aren't everyone's cup of tea, but one of the reasons that I spent so much time on PC gaming, especially back in the early 90s, was down to games like this. Now I have said before that I did grow up with the early arcade games in the 80s, but by the time it got to the 1990s I wasn't looking for fast-paced action, but instead games that took much longer to play and required a great deal of thought. So when a game like Caesar from the wonderful Sierra Online came along, I was going to jump in with both feet. It wasn't of course the first city building game that I had ever played, but it was the first one that had a world map. And by a world map I meant you could go outside the constraints of your own city and explore and make improvements to the world around you. And on top of that, it wasn't just a city builder where you had to manage your resources, build your town, grow your population and achieve all those basic tasks, but you also had to defend your city. Built within this seemingly standard city builder, you had some sort of military campaign as well, which really did take Caesar a step above games like SimCity. Of course, if you take all that and then mix in the fact that it's set in ancient Rome, and of course if you were a player who had a very keen interest in ancient mythology and ancient history, then there was going to be absolutely no doubt whatsoever that this game was going to sink its hooks into me and have me playing for hours on end, which is something that Caesar accomplished with me quite easily. But would I recommend you playing Caesar today? And I would probably say no, unless you're playing for nostalgic reasons. I can quite happily go back and play a few hours of Caesar, maybe even a few days or even a few months, but most of that of course is down to rose tinted glasses. And if you were looking to play a game much more like this, I would probably recommend the later games in the series. Not because Caesar is a bad game, it's just a very basic game, and the series made some dramatic improvements as it went along. So that is Caesar from Sierra Online in 1992.
Something incredible is happening that will give Sega Genesis even more power. Game Genie now works with your Sega Genesis system in most games, like Sonic the Hedgehog, Kid Chameleon, Toe Jam, and Earl. Game Genie for Sega Genesis.
Excellent.
Now it wasn't all PC in 1992 for me. I still had my side piece, the Sega Mega Drive. And who could talk about 1992 without talking about Sonic 2? Now of course Sonic the Hedgehog was an incredibly important game. It was the game that made me rush out and buy a Sega Mega Drive, as it encouraged many other people to do as well. And Sonic 2 was no less important. Whereas the first Sonic the Hedgehog game was most definitely a system seller, Sonic 2, for me anyway, marked the moment where video game culture was about to become mainstream. Now for the decades before, those of us out there that were hardcore gamers knew only too well that we were an isolated group, often referred to as nerds or geeks. And for many people, just simply confessing that you were into video games was something that you would shy away from. But the unbelievable hype and marketing campaign of Sonic 2 really did give the first solid indication that video games were definitely on the fast track to becoming mainstream. Now of course there had been video game marketing campaigns since the very beginning of video games in the home. The Magnavox Odyssey, the Atari video computer system, and even all the 8-bit microcomputers over here in the UK all had decent marketing campaigns, but none of them however would really compare to Sonic Tuesday, a marketing campaign so completely committed to its success that it released the game on a Tuesday, so it could be Sonic Tuesday. And for me, as I've already intimated, this was Sega saying that video games were coming to the mainstream and they could push their games to anyone out there. Now for me personally, I hold Sonic the Hedgehog, the first game, as not the better of the two games but my favourite of the two games. But with the introduction of not only new characters but also new gameplay mechanics, made Sonic 2 just that one step level higher when it came to the quality of the gameplay. The introduction of the crouch spin to build up speed, and of course the introduction of Tails, a new playable character, all added new aspects to the game that greatly improved on the first outing. Now normally I would end a section by recommending whether you should play this game these days, but for Sonic the Hedgehog 2 I would ask the question, why haven't you played it already, and why don't you still dip into it now and again? The whole Sonic franchise is so important that no one should miss out on it. And yes, I would say especially Sonic the Hedgehog 2 from Sega in 1992. Staying with the Mega Drive, we're going to be moving on to the next game that took up a lot of my time in 1992, and that was Desert Strike. Now you have to remember, even as late as 1992, the Sega Mega Drive was still a relatively new machine for me, and when it came to games that were quite a smooth transition from my 8-bit microcomputer days, then Desert Strike was definitely one of them, because if there's one thing that you did learn when you grew up with an 8-bit microcomputer, and that was top-down isometric pseudo 3D games were the mainstay of what we played towards the later years of the ZX Spectrum and the like. And Desert Strike was not only a more modern instalment in this style of gameplay, but it also drew heavily from two of my all-time favourite ZX Spectrum games, those being Tornado Low Level and Cyclone. And if you haven't experienced either of those two titles, then I heartily recommend that you check them out, especially if you're a fan of Desert Strike and the subsequent games that would come after that. Of course, if you're too lazy or just don't have the ability to play TLL or Cyclone yourself, you could drop down to the comments and ask me to play it for you, which is something that I'd be more than happy to do for you. Now of course it wasn't just the rose tinted glasses or even the updated graphics that made Desert Strike so important for me, because if I've said it once I've said it a million times, and that is gameplay is king. And as much as everyone out there who knows me knows that I don't play action games, for example shmups, I haven't played any of them since R-Type, Desert Strike, despite being a shooter at heart, was more of a strategic tactical shooter. Of course you did need a certain level of reflexes to play Desert Strike, it just wasn't as intense as most games of that ilk at that time. Much more important was the resource management and strategically planning your way across the map. You had to manage your fuel, your weapons, find and rescue prisoners of war, and of course plan the best route to take on each of the missions in every level. And that level of thought and complexity was just music to my ears. But would I recommend that you play Desert Strike now in 2023? And the answer to that is a resounding yes, because not only is it a classic game, it still looks great, the gameplay holds up, and it has more than enough challenge for modern and retro gamers. So yes, if you get a chance, get your hands on Desert Strike for the Sega Mega Drive or the other systems that it was on, and play this Electronic Arts classic from 1992. Now this one's going to be a bit of a surprise for a few of you out there, especially the long time viewers, because the next game that took up a lot of my time in 1992 was Super Mario Kart. I know, another Nintendo game in the pixel years, and I'm as surprised as you. But even in Scotland back in the late 80s and early 90s, we all had that one weirdo friend who had a Nintendo, didn't go down the Sega route. And because I was blessed with one of those Nintendo weirdos as a friend back in the day, it did afford me the privilege of discovering this wonderful game here, Super Mario Kart. Now don't get me wrong, there had been plenty of racing games that I had experienced all the way through from the 70s right up to 1992, which included stone cold classics such as Super Sprint, Pole Position, Checkered Flag and the amazing hard driving, none of which caught my attention quite as much as Super Mario Kart. And it's probably that this was the first time at home that the racing genre, and more importantly the combat racing genre, had the domestic hardware to back it up. You then add into the mix that you could play this not just as a one-player game, but a two-player game and compete against your weird old Nintendo friend, and I'm sure you can see why this was the type of game that would cause you to cut class. Because as I mentioned earlier, I didn't own this game myself, it belonged to a friend, and to get to play it, well, I pretty much had to cut class at college to go and play some Mario Kart. And I'm sure a lot of old school Mario Kart fans will agree that that was a good use of my time. The tracks were well balanced and unique, the weapons and upgrades had a fantastic range of uses that ranged from projectile weapons to slip traps, and of course it was littered with those cute and wonderful Mario icons. Now the game itself isn't incredibly difficult and anyone who's played it will probably attest to that, But this first formula for Mario Kart was certainly groundbreaking, and it goes to show because we're now on Mario Kart 8. But of course that leads us on to the final question, and that is, would I recommend you playing Mario Kart or Super Mario Kart in 2023? Now, nostalgia tinted glasses don't always guide me in my taste when it comes to games. And as for Super Mario Kart, if you do have some nostalgia, it might be fun for half an hour or so, but I would more likely recommend you to go ahead and just play Mario Kart 8, the latest iteration of the game, because as good as Super Mario Kart from 1992 is, it's not the best on offer out there anymore.
I'll tell you some old stories, Vampire. No way, dude! I'm having a most radically bodacious experience with this Sega Game Gear. Remember old Bertie? Wow! Check this atypical color screen, man. Filthy graphics and a free day. Oh, those were the days. You could turn it into TV. Wow, excellent, with headphones. Party on! Grandma.
So there you go, my friends, that was 1992 through the rose-tinted spectacles of yours truly. And what did you think of that? Because this part of the show is all about you. I want you to drop down into the comments and we'll talk about the games, the music, the movies, anything that you've seen today, and reminisce about one of the golden years of video game history as well as pop culture history. Because the interaction between you and me, well, that's what makes YouTube special. It does for me. Now, you don't have to have been alive during the time of 1992, because I'm sure you've experienced some of the games, listened to the music and watched the movies too. So feel free, chime in down in the comments. Thank you very much for watching as always, and until next time, where it will be 1993, cheerio.
Now, when you buy the Sega Genesis that comes with Sonic 1, you'll get Sonic 2 absolutely free. Sonic 2 handles stubborn stains, embarrassing bald spots, no problem. It even slices and dices, makes thousands of julienne fries. But wait, you can play it too. This free Sonic 2 is a $54.99 value. You get 2 Sonics for the price of 1. Sonic 2 fits easily into any tackle box. Made from a space-age polymer plastic for years of family fun, and pets love it too. Buy the Sega Genesis that comes with Sonic 1 and get Sonic 2 free.
Act now. Wiener Dog Sweater sold separately.